the older Mafia boss who knows she's too young, but can't stay away from the waitress. Vincent Castellano sits alone in the corner booth of Oriole, the upscale restaurant he owns on Royal Street. At 45, dressed in a charcoal Italian suit, he blends into the low evening hum, except his attention is fixed on the young woman moving through the dining room. Simone Harper works with calm confidence, weaving between tables with a grace that turns heads without trying. Her deep brown skin catches the warm lighting, her natural hair twisted neatly, her uniform simple but striking on her. She laughs at something a customer says, and Vincent feels a tightness in his chest he refuses to name. For 2 months, he has shown up every Thursday at 8. Same table. Same request. Her section only. He tells himself he's here for the food, for the quiet, for anything other than the truth. He knows the lines he's crossing. Age, power, position. She is 23. She works for him. He should walk away. But tonight, Simone steps up to his table, sets down his drink, and their eyes meet. In that moment, the man who controls half of Louisiana's criminal world feels something slip. Something he's always kept locked down. What would you do if you were drawn to someone you knew you shouldn't want? Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for tomorrow's story. Let's begin. Vincent Castellano was born into a world where choices were made long before he took his first breath. The Castellano name carried weight in Louisiana, built over decades of alliances, money, and fear. His father had controlled the Mississippi River ports, securing influence that stretched from the warehouses near the riverfront to offshore operations along the Gulf Coast. By the time Vincent was 25, the empire was already waiting for him. His inheritance wasn't written on paper. It lived in expectations, in meetings held in quiet rooms, and in the way people stepped aside when he walked through a doorway. Now at 45, Vincent ran that empire with a steady hand. He oversaw legitimate businesses that gave structure to everything underneath. Restaurants, jazz clubs, a construction company that handled half the city's renovation contracts, and a small chain of wine bars popular with tourists. Oriole, the restaurant on Royal Street, was both a pride project and a shield. It brought in wealthy clientele, established a public-facing reputation, and allowed him to blend into the normal world when he needed to. His life in the Garden District mansion was orderly and controlled. Tall ceilings, dark wood, curated art, and a staff that kept everything running without him lifting a finger. Yet the place felt quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It carried the silence of someone who had everything except someone to share it with. Relationships had never been his strength. He dated women his age, professionals, artists, lawyers, women who understood the demands of adulthood and matched his experience. But his world always pushed them away. Some couldn't handle the constant security presence. Others wanted emotional closeness Vincent couldn't offer. A few simply didn't want to stay connected to a man whose last name attracted attention from federal agents. The endings were clean, but they left him with a hollow acceptance. He was built for responsibility, not romance. Across the city, Simone Harper was building her life from a completely different starting point. She grew up in the Treme neighborhood, a place woven with culture, music, and resilience. Her grandmother's shotgun house had been in the family for generations, narrow, warm, full of memories. Even as the neighborhood changed with rising rents and shifting demographics, Simone held tight to the values she was raised with. Work hard, keep your dignity, and make choices that honor the people who came before you. She attended public schools, always excelling, always the student teachers relied on. Getting into Tulane for business administration was a milestone her entire family celebrated. But scholarships only covered so much, and Simone refused to depend on anyone to carry the rest. That's how she ended up working 2 jobs, morning shifts at a community cafe on Oretha Castle Haley Boulevard, and evening shifts at Oriole. The cafe job kept her grounded. She served neighbors, activists, elders who told stories about the old days, and fellow students trying to change the world through sociology and urban policy degrees. Tips were modest, but the environment felt like home. Oriole was different. The pace was faster, the customers wealthier, the expectations sharp. But the money was better, far better. It paid for textbooks, gas, groceries, and the tuition gap that financial aid didn't cover. The restaurant's name also held weight on a resume. If she wanted to work in business consulting or management after graduation, experience at a respected establishment would matter. At 23, Simone carried herself with calm maturity. She understood people quickly and had learned how to handle customers who felt entitled to more attention than they deserved. Nothing threw her off balance. She moved with quiet confidence, and even during stressful nights, she stayed composed. 3 weeks after she started at Oriole, she caught Vincent's attention. Not because she was young or pretty, but because he knew efficiency when he saw it. He watched her handle a rude customer with a level of professionalism that would have unraveled most servers. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't let irritation flicker across her face. She redirected the conversation smoothly, delivered the order correctly, and even managed to earn a small smile from a man known for complaining about everything. Vincent respected skill. It was one of the only things in life he valued without question. And Simone had it. Still, acknowledging her competence should have been the end of it. He'd seen talented staff come and go over the years. He never mixed personal interest with his businesses. It was a rule he held firmly, a line he crossed for no one. But something about her stayed with him even after he left the restaurant that night. She had an intelligence that showed in every decision she made on the floor. She listened carefully, spoke thoughtfully, and held herself with pride despite serving people who rarely treated service staff as equals. In his world, power came easily. Respect was automatic. But watching Simone work reminded him of a time before he inherited authority. A time when he had to prove his worth. Without realizing it, he started choosing Thursdays at Oriole. At first, it was coincidence. Meetings that ended early, nights when he didn't want to stay at home. But the pattern formed quickly, and he didn't question it. He noticed her schedule. He noticed her working style. He noticed how she avoided depending on anyone else. The distance between their lives was obvious, yet he felt drawn to the quiet discipline she demonstrated every day. He should have kept that distance. He should have remained the anonymous owner, the man who occasionally dined in his own restaurant without getting involved in the staff's personal lives. But noticing her was one thing. What came next was where Vincent crossed the line he'd promised himself he'd never approach. The pattern began quietly, without announcement, without visible intent. Vincent simply showed up one Thursday evening at 8 o'clock, asked for table 12, and requested to be seated in the section where Simone was working. The hostess, used to powerful men wanting the same server for convenience, didn't think much of it. Simone didn't either, not at first. Some guests preferred familiar faces. But the next Thursday, he arrived again at the same time. Then the next. After week 4, staff began to joke about Vincent's consistency, but never within earshot. Everyone who worked at Oriole understood exactly who he was. They knew his charities, his influence, his money, legitimate and otherwise. They also knew better than to make assumptions about a man who kept most of his inner life sealed away. Simone served him each week with professional distance, though their conversations gradually stretched longer. He always greeted her the same way, with a calm good evening, never raised his voice, never rushed her, never trivialized her. She noticed he listened. Really listened. Most customers only waited for their turn to speak. By the 6th week, the ritual had settled into something neither of them named. On the first Thursday, Vincent asked her how classes were going. She answered politely, expecting the usual half-interest. But the next week, he remembered the name of her accounting professor. He remembered the midterm schedule she'd mentioned offhand while refilling his water. That sort of attention was rare. It unnerved her, but not in the way she normally associated with older men. There was no suggestive tone. No smirk. No attempt to draw the conversation toward her appearance. He tipped 40% every time. Quietly. No theatrics. The kind of gratuity that could cover groceries for 2 weeks. Simone, who worked 2 jobs and stretched her expenses with precision, couldn't pretend the money didn't help. But what stayed with her more than the cash was the way he kept trying to understand her world. He never acted above her. Never pushed. Over the next 6 Thursdays, a rhythm formed. He asked a question, she answered. She asked one back, he responded with unexpected clarity. Their conversation moved from her coursework to New Orleans history, to the complicated layers that shaped the city: race, power, legacy, recovery, loss. Vincent never spoke about himself directly, but his insights hinted at someone who had seen the city from angles she couldn't imagine. Simone began recognizing the difference between Vincent and the usual customers who flirted for sport. He didn't stare at her body. His attention was sharper, more disciplined. He made eye contact, held it only long enough to show respect, then looked away before it turned inappropriate. Still, she knew interest when she saw it. She'd been serving tables since she was 16. Women in her family taught her early how to read a man's intentions by the shift of his shoulders, the tone of his voice, the restraint, or lack thereof, in his posture. Vincent's restraint was overwhelming, as if he was constantly checking himself. It would have been flattering, even comforting, if not for the sharp contrast between their lives. Meanwhile, Vincent battled numbers that refused to leave him alone. He replayed them while she spoke, numbers that marked the distance between them. When he finished college, she didn't exist. When he turned 28 and committed his first killing, she was a child learning to read. The age gap wasn't a gap, it was a canyon. He was old enough to be her father, old enough to know better. Each Thursday he reminded himself to stop coming back. Each Thursday he returned anyway. The most disturbing part for him wasn't desire. He'd felt desire before. What troubled him was the question of why she mattered. Why this young woman, whose life should have remained in the margin of his world, kept pulling him toward a line he had avoided for decades. He didn't want innocence. He didn't want to control anyone. Yet he kept showing up for her, searching for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. Simone felt the shift too. She started preparing more for Thursday shifts. Nothing dramatic, just subtle adjustments. A neater bun. A bit of gloss. A minute longer choosing earrings. She didn't admit to herself why she did it. She simply knew that Thursdays had become the one day of the week she didn't dread the dinner rush. She was attracted to him, though she didn't label it that way. She liked the calm he carried, the intelligence woven through his comments, the authority that didn't crush the space around it. Vincent wasn't charming in the typical sense. He was too controlled for that. But he was steady, observant, sharp without arrogance. She told herself she admired him the way a student admires a professor. That was safer. Easier. For 6 weeks, they stood on a line neither acknowledged out loud. Nothing inappropriate passed between them. No invitations. No suggestive remarks. No lingering touches beyond the occasional brush of fingertips when she collected his payment. Yet the tension lived in the pauses between their conversations. In the silence after she walked away from his table. In the way she pretended not to search for him on the reservation list each Thursday afternoon. One evening, late in the 6th week, their conversation drifted to her senior thesis. She explained her focus on generational wealth gaps across New Orleans after Katrina, how entire communities struggled to rebuild without insurance payouts or savings, while wealthier neighborhoods recovered quickly. Vincent listened quietly before offering a perspective that startled her. He spoke about ownership, inheritance, structural barriers, and the power networks that controlled contracts during Reconstruction. His knowledge went beyond economics. It felt lived, as if he'd witnessed every deal firsthand. Her breath caught for a moment. He wasn't guessing. He understood the machinery behind the city's recovery in ways someone outside its deepest circles couldn't. Their eyes met, and something unspoken tightened between them. For 6 weeks, they balanced in that unsteady place between appropriate and dangerous. Then one afternoon, Simone mentioned Vincent's name to the wrong person. It happened on a slow Sunday afternoon, the kind where the staff leaned against counters and traded gossip to pass the time. Simone was polishing glasses when she mentioned, without much thought, my Thursday regular at table 12 was asking about my thesis again. Desiree, who had been a server at Oriole for more than a decade, froze mid-stride. The man who always sits at 12? She asked, her voice low. Yeah, Simone answered, confused by the sudden tension. Tall, salt and pepper hair, Italian suits. Tips well. Desiree set down the tray she'd been carrying and looked Simone straight in the eye. Baby, you're talking about Vincent Castellano. The weight of the name meant nothing to Simone at first. She blinked. Okay, and... Desiree exhaled sharply. He owns this place. Simone's stomach tightened. He owns Oriole? I thought the company owned it. He is the company, Desiree replied. And that's just the surface. His family practically runs half the French Quarter. Construction contracts, ports, clubs, you name it. They're connected. The pause between her words held a meaning Simone didn't miss. Connected in New Orleans rarely meant networking and philanthropy. It meant power that operated without oversight. It meant men who didn't answer to anyone. She felt her hands go still around the wineglass she was holding. Desiree continued quietly, you're smart. You know what I'm saying. Simone did. All too well. The stories from her grandmother, spoken in the living room of the old Treme shotgun house, came back with sudden clarity. Warnings about men whose wealth came with invisible strings, men who could offer the world but take everything with the same hand. Her mother used to say the Garden District was filled with kings who walked around in tailored shirts instead of crowns. Men who smiled kindly while reminding everyone who actually held the keys. Simone had thought Vincent was simply older. Strict. Wealthy in the way established businessmen often were. But this? This was something else entirely. This was a level of influence that turned the careful balance of their Thursday rituals into something lopsided and dangerous. She set the glass down and steadied her breathing. Thank you, she said softly, and Desiree squeezed her arm in silent understanding. The entire week that followed felt different. Not because Vincent was there, he wasn't, but because she now understood what she had been participating in without knowing it. Every remembered detail, every thoughtful question, every lingering exchange took on new weight. By the time Thursday arrived, Simone had rehearsed exactly how she would handle him. When Vincent walked into the restaurant at 8, right on time, the staff greeted him with the usual subtle deference. He nodded politely, though something in his posture softened when his eyes found Simone across the room. She held herself steady, shoulders straight, expression unreadable. He was seated at table 12. When she approached him, she didn't smile the way she usually did. She recited the specials with crisp professionalism, no warmth threading through her voice. She didn't linger, didn't open the door to conversation. Her answers were short, polite, and pointedly distant. Vincent felt the shift immediately. He'd built an entire career on reading faces, weighing tone, sensing the slightest change in a room. Simone's distance wasn't subtle. It was intentional. It told him she knew something, maybe not everything, but enough to be wary. By the time she brought the check, his expression had changed from controlled interest to quiet remorse. He didn't try to charm her. He didn't press. He simply said, I can tell something has changed. Whatever you heard. I'm sorry it made you uncomfortable. Simone kept her hands steady as she placed the bill on the table. Mr. Castellano, she said, placing deliberate emphasis on his last name, I think it's best we keep things professional. Strictly professional. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not from anger, she could tell, but from disappointment. Or acceptance. Understood, he replied. You won't have trouble from me. He stood, gave a respectful nod, and left without another word. Simone watched him go from the corner of her eye, feeling relief and something else. Something she didn't want to name, settle in her chest. Vincent didn't return the next week. Or the one after that. Or the one after that. He threw himself into business, according to quiet murmurs around the city. Meetings at the port, expansion deals, late-night calls with contractors. He buried himself in work the same way he'd buried emotions all his life. Except this time, the distraction wasn't working. Thursday nights arrived like reminders he couldn't outrun. Across town, Simone spent those same Thursdays convincing herself she'd made the right choice. That distance was necessary. That boundaries mattered. But each week his absence left a gap she couldn't quite dismiss. The quiet at table 12 no longer felt neutral. It felt like something missing. 3 weeks should have been enough to let whatever existed between them dissolve into the past. But the city had other plans. Because 3 weeks after their final conversation, violence tore through the fragile space they'd created, proving neither of them could simply walk away. The Friday night rush had ended hours earlier, but Simone was still on her feet. It was close to midnight, and she'd been working for 14 hours straight, double shift, short-staffed, no breaks. The dining room was quiet now, chairs lifted onto tables, floor half-mopped, kitchen dark except for the glow of the prep lights. She was locking the side door when 3 men pushed their way inside. They didn't look like customers. No hesitation, no confusion about closing times. Their expressions were sharp, their movements aggressive in the way people get when they walk into a place expecting trouble. "Where's Castellano?" the tallest one demanded, scanning the room like he owned it. Simone stepped back. "The restaurant's closed. You'll need to leave." He laughed under his breath. "We're not here to eat. We're here to talk about respect and territory." Her pulse kicked up. Behind her, the general manager whispered urgently into the office phone, trying to reach someone, anyone, who could help. The men kept advancing. Another one muttered, "Funny how he's not here when it matters. Coward sends messages but won't show his face." Simone reached for her phone to call the police, but before she could dial, one of them grabbed her wrist. Hard. His grip crushed her skin, forcing her phone out of her hand and onto the floor. "You're not calling anyone," he said. The pressure made her wince. She tried to pull away, but he tightened his hold. The staff immediately scattered, some rushing toward the kitchen, others backing away with their hands raised. Simone was shoved toward the bar area as the men continued shouting threats about ports, shipments, who controlled what, who deserved respect. Her heart hammered. Her skin burned under the man's grip. Then the front door opened. The entire room shifted. Vincent's voice cut through the tension, low and calm in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Let her go." The man holding her wrist smirked but didn't release her. "Look who finally decided to show." Vincent stepped forward, wearing a dark coat over one of his tailored suits, his expression unreadable. 2 men followed behind him, silent, sharply dressed, and radiating authority. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. But the power in the room instantly changed direction. "This is your only warning," Vincent said. "Let her go." The man tightened his grip on Simone, testing him. Vincent's tone didn't shift, but something in the air snapped anyway. "Touching one of my employees was your second mistake." He paused. "Walking in here tonight was your first." The general manager quietly ushered Simone toward the kitchen. Vincent gave her a barely perceptible nod. "Go." She ran. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, muffling the confrontation. For 8 long minutes, she stood with the staff in the cramped space, chest tight, unable to hear everything but catching pieces. Voices low and threatening, movement, something heavy striking a wall, something glass shattering. Each sound made her flinch. Every minute felt stretched, the kind of tension that made seconds drip like cold water down her spine. When the door finally opened again, silence followed. Simone stepped out cautiously. The 3 men were gone. The only signs they'd been there were a broken glass near the bar, a scuff on one of the chairs, and Vincent, standing with bruised knuckles, sleeves pushed up, speaking quietly to the 2 men who'd arrived with him. They definitely weren't restaurant staff. Vincent turned when he heard her footsteps. Everything else around him faded. He crossed the room to her in a few quick strides. "Are you hurt?" His voice was steady but threaded with something raw. "I'm okay," she said, though her wrist stung. Vincent gently took her arm, turning it to see where the man had grabbed her. Red marks streaked across her skin, angry and clear. His jaw clenched, but his touch remained careful, soft in a way that contrasted sharply with whatever had happened minutes earlier. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This is my fault. My world bleeding into yours." The apology hit her harder than the grip had. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't pretending she hadn't just been caught in the middle of something she didn't understand. He was owning it, fully, without evasion. Simone studied him closely. His bruised knuckles. The tension in his shoulders. The concern in his eyes that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with her. It was the first time she'd seen both versions of him in one night. The man capable of violence and the man standing in front of her now, carefully inspecting her wrist like she was something he needed to protect. No one had ever looked at her like that. Vincent stepped back slightly, forcing himself to breathe. "Security changes start today. All closing shifts will have staff escort. Guards posted outside during late hours. No exceptions." Simone swallowed. "Because of me?" "Because it should have been done already," he answered. "But yes, especially because of you." The honesty tangled something inside her. She knew he was dangerous. She knew his world carried weight and consequences. But tonight, the danger hadn't been aimed at her. He had walked into it for her. And that changed everything. Up until this moment, distance had felt necessary. Safe. Responsible. Now she wasn't sure safety and distance were the same thing. Something had shifted between them. Something neither of them could pretend wasn't there anymore. Because after tonight, staying away wasn't just difficult. It was impossible. What came next would test everything they thought they understood about power, choice, and the cost of wanting someone you shouldn't touch. The weeks after the incident settled into a rhythm that made no sense yet felt inevitable. Vincent didn't avoid Oriole anymore, but he didn't seek Simone out either. He came in quietly, stayed seated, kept his distance, and never lingered after his meals. He didn't flirt. He didn't initiate conversations. He didn't even request her section. But he was present. Always somewhere close enough to see her, far enough to prove he wasn't taking advantage of her discomfort. His bodyguards rotated through the restaurant discreetly, posted near entrances, shadowing closing staff. Doors were checked twice. Walks to the parking lot happened in pairs. For Simone, the adjustment was complicated. She appreciated the heightened security, especially after what happened, but the tension between them had only grown thicker. She felt him in the room before she saw him. She caught herself listening for his voice when he spoke to the manager or the bartender. Even when she tried to focus on work, her awareness kept drifting toward the man who stayed just far enough away to respect her boundaries, yet close enough to make it clear he wasn't letting anything happen to her again. And that contradiction was tearing her apart. She knew this wasn't simple. She knew the age gap alone would make people talk. She knew the difference in power between them wasn't small or easy to navigate. She knew his world was messy, dangerous, and built on foundations that never touched hers. She knew the racial dynamics layered over everything in ways that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Every reason she had to walk away was real. But the pull she felt toward him was just as real. She hated the idea of other people assuming she needed protecting from her own judgment, especially after years of building a life where she made every decision for herself. She paid her tuition. She paid her bills. She worked 2 jobs. She didn't let anyone else speak for her. So why was she letting this situation control her instead of deciding for herself? That question stuck with her. It stuck with her long enough that, one night in early December, she sat down at her laptop and did something she hadn't done before. She researched Vincent Castellano. Not rumors. Not hushed stories. Not second-hand warnings. Facts. She read about the Castellano construction empire, the port contracts, the real estate acquisitions that stretched from the riverfront to the edge of the business district, the legal companies that made up the public face of his wealth, and the whispers that made up the rest. She saw pictures of him at charity events, photographed beside politicians who smiled too easily, articles celebrating his donations to local schools, mentions of his involvement with historic preservation committees, notes on his business strategies that were sharp, efficient, and ruthless. She wanted to understand the real scope of the man she'd been talking to every Thursday. By the end of the night, she closed her laptop and sat in silence. She wasn't naive anymore. If she chose him, she would be choosing everything that came with him. 3 days later, on a Thursday night, she made her choice. Vincent was at table 12, finishing a late dinner with his usual reserve. He didn't look up when she walked toward him, because he wasn't expecting her. She was no longer in uniform. She had changed into dark jeans, a sweater, and her jacket, her hair loosened from its work twist. She looked like someone who had finished her shift and was ready to go home. But she wasn't going home. She stopped at his table. "Mr. Castellano," she said. His eyes lifted. The moment he saw her changed out of uniform, something shifted in his posture. Alert, cautious, hopeful all at once. "Simone, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I want to talk to you." "Of course." He gestured to the seat across from him, but his expression was careful, controlled. "Is something wrong?" "She Saturday, I've been thinking a lot over the last few weeks." He waited, hands folded, shoulders tight with restraint. She continued, "I know exactly how complicated this is. The age difference. Your position. My position. What people will say. What they won't say but will assume anyway. The parts of your world that are dangerous. The parts of mine you've stepped into without realizing the weight of it." She took a breath. "I'm not blind to any of that." Vincent exhaled slowly, looking pained. "Simone. I'm not finished." He stopped. She held his gaze. "You've been making decisions for me. Trying to protect me. Keeping your distance so I don't feel pressured. I appreciate it. Truly. But if this is going to be real, if anything between us is going to be real, then I get a say." Her voice remained steady. "So here it is, I want to have dinner with you. As two adults. Not as your employee and not as the girl you're trying to stay away from." He closed his eyes for a moment, like her words hit a place he'd been avoiding. When he opened them, they were troubled. "Simone. I am 45 years old. I know. I'm involved in things you shouldn't be anywhere near. I know that too. The right thing, the responsible thing, is for me to say no." She leaned forward slightly. "Then say no because you don't want this. Not because you think you're protecting me from choices that are mine to make." The silence that followed was thick, loaded with everything he'd been suppressing. Finally, he spoke. Quietly. Honestly. "Every part of me wants to say yes. More than I've wanted anything in a long time." His voice tightened. "Which is exactly why I should say no." Simone held his gaze. "But you're not going to." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "No, I'm not." A slow breath escaped her chest, relief, anticipation, and something deeper. They sat with that decision, knowing it wasn't simple, knowing it wasn't easy, knowing it wasn't safe in the traditional sense. But for the first time, it was theirs. "Dinner," Vincent said quietly. "No titles. No walls. Just us." "Exactly," she replied. What started that night wasn't a fantasy. It was something more complicated, more fragile, and far harder than either of them expected. The early months of their relationship felt like stepping across an invisible threshold, one Simone had spent her whole life aware of but had never imagined crossing. Vincent didn't ease her in gradually, that wasn't his nature. Instead, he opened the door to everything at once, letting her see the full scope of the world he moved through. Their first dinner outside Oriole wasn't at a casual spot or some unmarked hole in the wall. Vincent took her to Le Collier, a restaurant where a single entree cost more than her entire paycheck from a double shift. She almost turned around at the door, acutely aware her best dress was an off-the-rack piece from a weekend clearance rack, not custom silk. But Vincent looked at her as though she was the one elevating the room, not the chandelier, not the polished marble floors, not the crowd of people whose bank accounts were measured in digits she couldn't comprehend. He didn't flaunt anything. He didn't boast. But wealth clung to him effortlessly. His tailored suits, the quiet authority with which staff addressed him, the way the owner stopped by the table to greet him personally. Simone realized, in moments like these, that he didn't just frequent these places. He helped shape the landscape they existed in. The next week, he invited her to his home in the Garden District. She expected something impressive, but she wasn't prepared for the scale, a historic mansion restored with the kind of precision that required not just money but influence. Walls lined with original art, pieces she had only ever seen in textbooks. Furniture crafted by designers whose names she couldn't pronounce. A private library filled with first editions. Every detail whispered one thing. This was a man accustomed to a level of power few people ever touched. But the surface beauty carried its own weight. Armed guards outside the gate. Discreet cameras. A staff that watched everything with sharp eyes. Even in his own home, Vincent didn't get to relax fully. And for the first time, Simone understood that his world wasn't comfortable, it was controlled. He showed her the bright side, but he didn't shield her from the cost. The tension in his shoulders when he got certain phone calls. The way his expression hardened when he read certain messages. The silent exchanges between him and the men who worked for him, conversations held without words, built on years of dealing with threats where hesitation meant death. Simone saw it all. Yet she never let any of this alter her independence. When Vincent offered to take care of her bills so she could cut back her hours, she refused. When he hinted she didn't need to work closing shifts anymore, she told him she wouldn't be treated like something breakable. She kept bussing tables, carrying trays, clocking in and out like every other server. She refused to give him the power to shape her entire life. Her grandmother noticed the shift in her mood before anyone else. One Sunday morning, while braiding Simone's hair, she spoke quietly. "Men like that are charming until they own you," she murmured. "And that age difference? He's lived a whole life you weren't part of. He's got years on you, baby. Years, and power you can't balance." Simone didn't argue. She understood the warning came from love, and from history. Her family had always known what it meant to be on the outside looking in, especially in a city like New Orleans, where old money and old debts carried long shadows. But she also knew what she felt for Vincent wasn't naive or impulsive. It wasn't a fantasy she'd been swept into. She was choosing him with her eyes open. Their biggest challenge came when they tried to exist in public together. At a restaurant on Magazine Street, the maitre d' looked her up and down with the kind of dismissive expression that burned straight through her patience. He barely acknowledged her presence, addressing only Vincent's reservation. It wasn't until Vincent arrived, late from a meeting, that the man transformed, suddenly polite, suddenly eager to please. The shift made Simone's stomach twist. Vincent saw it immediately. "That won't happen again," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. She didn't doubt him. But that wasn't the point. Needing his presence just to be treated with basic respect didn't feel like protection. It felt like a reminder of every imbalance between them: wealth, race, age, power, influence. In his world, she was noticed only when he chose to stand beside her. Vincent struggled too, but for different reasons. More than once, she caught him watching her with a mix of longing and guilt, like he was silently weighing what he was giving her against what he was taking from her. One evening, after an especially tense day, he spoke the words he'd clearly been holding back for weeks. "You should be with someone your own age," he said. "Someone who can walk down the street with you without two men following behind us. Someone who doesn't bring danger to your doorstep. Someone whose future isn't tied to lawyers and federal hearings. Simone didn't flinch. "I'm with you," she replied. "And you need to respect that I'm choosing this. Not blindly. Not because I need saving. Because I decided the cost is worth it." Vincent looked wrecked by that. Not relieved, wrecked. Because her choosing him meant he had a responsibility he couldn't take lightly. Their relationship settled into a balance that wasn't perfect but was honest. They didn't pretend their problems didn't exist. They didn't bury the differences between them. They didn't romanticize the danger or minimize the challenges. They acknowledged everything, and stayed anyway. Real love didn't erase complications. It demanded they confront them head-on together, with constant accountability and a commitment to truth, even when the truth was hard. Love didn't make the complications disappear. It just meant they had to navigate them together, with clear eyes and difficult conversations, knowing the road ahead wouldn't be gentle. A full year passed before either of them realized how much their lives had reshaped around one another. Simone was weeks away from graduating from Tulane, juggling final papers, capstone meetings, and the quiet hum of nerves that came from waiting on decisions that could determine the next decade of her life. The acceptance letters arrived in batches, thick envelopes, embossed seals, congratulatory emails from schools she once thought were galaxies away. Harvard, Stanford, University of Chicago. Programs that admitted fewer than 10% of applicants. Programs that practically guaranteed high-level careers in policy and research. Each one represented a door that would take her far from New Orleans, and far from Vincent. She laid the letters out on her bed, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and dread. These were her achievements. Her work. Her sacrifices. Her late-night study sessions after double shifts. Her years of pushing past the expectations people had placed on a black girl from Treme who dared to aim high. Yet the weight of the decision settled heavy on her chest. When she told Vincent, she expected hesitation. Silence. Some sign of the fear she knew had to be running through him at the idea of losing her. Instead, he listened quietly, jaw tight, eyes soft. "You should go," he said. "Not out of politeness, out of conviction. You earned this. You don't let anyone limit your future. Not even me. Especially not me." The words stung more than she expected. Not because they were wrong, because they were selfless. Because he meant them. Because he'd rather lose her than become the man people assumed he already was. She tried to joke about it, asking if he was trying to get rid of her. He shook his head, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "I want you to have a life that isn't shaped by the risks I take," he said. "If that means I watch you build it from miles away, I'll deal with that. I won't hold you here." It was the exact kind of love that made leaving harder. Over the next few days, family members weighed in with their expectations. Her grandmother was proud, overwhelmingly proud, but also wary. "Don't you tie your future to a man, baby," she'd warned. "Not one with his kind of history. You worked too hard to dim yourself now." Simone understood the concern. She understood the optics. A brilliant young black woman turning down elite programs to stay with a man nearly twice her age who moved through dangerous circles. It invited judgment from every direction. But the truth was simple. She wanted to stay. Not because Vincent asked her to. Not because she felt pressured. Because her life, her ambitions, her relationships, and her community were rooted here. And because she knew she couldn't build a future she cared about by abandoning the place that shaped her. When Loyola's acceptance arrived, it felt like clarity. Their master's program in urban development had been her top choice for years. Long before Vincent ever sat at table 12. Their work focused on rebuilding neighborhoods after disaster, on equity and economic justice in cities scarred by storms and neglect. It was the kind of work she could see herself doing for decades. So when she went to Vincent's house that night, letter in hand, she didn't feel uncertain. She felt grounded. He read the offer twice, his expression unreadable. "You chose to stay," he said slowly. "Simone. You can't do that for me." I didn't. Her voice was steady. I chose it for me. For this city. But also for us. I want this program, and I want you. I'm allowed to want both. The words settled between them, heavy with truth. She wasn't asking permission. She wasn't sacrificing her dreams. She was claiming all of them at once. Vincent exhaled, something tense in him loosening. I needed to hear that, he said quietly. I can't be the reason you shrink your life. You're not, she replied. But you are part of the life I'm building. That's my decision, not yours, not my grandmother's, not anyone else's. For the first time, he didn't argue. Their relationship shifted subtly after that. Vincent didn't hover over her academic plans or offer to bankroll her housing or buy her textbooks. He didn't try to influence her career goals. Instead, he listened attentively when she talked about her passion for equitable redevelopment, about the red tape that slowed revitalization of low-income neighborhoods, about historic displacement patterns that still shaped New Orleans generations later. He supported her work not by steering it, but by showing up in ways that didn't interfere with her autonomy. When she needed contacts for a class project, he made introductions but stepped back. When she presented a proposal on rebuilding a neglected corridor in St. Bernard Parish, he quietly funded a community meeting space so residents could attend without financial barriers. Not to control her work. Not to take credit. But because her commitment to the city stirred something in him, a desire to build rather than destroy, to contribute rather than dominate. Simone maintained her own income, her own routines, her own circles. She balanced her love for him with a fierce insistence on her independence. Not because she feared him, but because she respected herself. They both understood the balance they'd achieved was delicate. It needed constant care, steady communication, and a willingness to confront hard truths without running from them. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was theirs. What they built wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And in a world full of pretty lies, that honesty was worth everything. 2 years into graduate school, Simone's days were longer than ever, but they finally felt like they belonged fully to her. Her classes at Loyola challenged her in ways undergrad never did. Policy modeling, community-led redevelopment frameworks, environmental justice, post-disaster economic recovery planning. She split her time between seminars and fieldwork in neighborhoods that carried the weight of history, Treme, Central City, the lower Ninth Ward. She wasn't just studying theory anymore. She was interviewing families who'd been displaced after Katrina, evaluating abandoned properties for redevelopment potential, and working with non-profit coalitions focused on restoring generational stability to Black communities that had been neglected for decades. Every piece of research, every case study, every interview felt like a step toward something greater. Vincent watched her work evolve with a kind of reverence he didn't express about much else. He had built his life on control, force, negotiation, and, when necessary, violence. But Simone's world demanded a different kind of strength. One built on listening, collaboration, patience, and an unyielding commitment to fairness. He admired that more than he ever said aloud. And slowly, under her influence, he changed. Not in a dramatic redemption arc. Not in a way that erased the world he operated in. But in tangible ways that mattered. He invested in local businesses that actually uplifted communities. Affordable cafes, daycare centers with sliding scale fees, a community laundromat in the lower Ninth where families could wash clothes free once a week. He funded job training programs without slapping his name on anything. He didn't shift his entire empire overnight, but he stopped pretending that his work didn't affect the city he claimed to love. Their relationship had steadied into something real, still complicated, still requiring constant attentiveness, but undeniably theirs. They didn't pretend their differences didn't matter. They didn't pretend the past or the power dynamics or the societal expectations weren't there. They just worked through each complication as honestly as they could. And in that honesty lived the lessons their story carried. They talked openly about everything people whispered behind closed doors. The age difference, the fact that he'd once been her employer, the racial dynamics baked into a city like New Orleans, the wealth gap that could swallow entire neighborhoods. Acknowledging these realities didn't make them vanish. It just meant they dealt with them directly instead of hiding behind excuses or flattery. Their relationship wasn't built on denial. It was built on clarity. Simone's choices were fully hers, but she understood those choices were shaped by the world she lived in, by race, by class, by opportunity, by history. She didn't pretend her decisions existed outside these systems. True agency required looking at the bigger picture, not just her personal feelings. Vincent respected her decisions because she made them with full awareness, not from naivety or convenience. Vincent had decades of experience behind him, but what truly separated him from men who abused their positions was the way he handled power. He didn't manipulate her. He didn't use his resources as leverage or guilt. Whenever a situation arose where his influence could overshadow hers, he paused. He listened. He recalibrated. His maturity wasn't in knowing more. It was in recognizing the weight he carried and choosing not to use it unfairly. Their affection didn't erase the disparities between them. It didn't rewrite American history or soften the truths about race, class, and gender. They still had hard conversations about the stares they received in certain neighborhoods, about implicit bias, about how people spoke to her when he wasn't around versus when he was. Their bond required constant communication, uncomfortable honesty, and a refusal to ignore reality for the sake of romance. Some relationships fall neatly into clear categories, good or bad, right or wrong. Theirs never did. They lived in a space where good people made complicated decisions, where love didn't erase moral ambiguity, where choosing each other meant accepting a long list of contradictions. Their story wasn't meant to tell others what to do. It was a reminder that human connection is messy, layered, and often unclassifiable. A wealthy white man and a young black woman in America don't exist in a vacuum, especially not in a city still shaped by segregation, exploitation, and uneven recovery efforts. Simone knew this. Vincent knew it too. That awareness didn't forbid their relationship. It simply meant they approached it with responsibility rather than carelessness. They couldn't change the past, but they could honor the weight of it. One warm spring evening, they sat together on Vincent's balcony overlooking the Garden District. The sun dipped low across rooftops, casting soft light over the manicured lawns and ornate ironwork. Simone was poring over her latest project, developing a community land trust framework to prevent displacement in historically black neighborhoods. Vincent listened as she explained the long-term goals, running his thumb along the rim of his glass. There were no grand declarations, no promises of a simple future. Just two people choosing one another while staying mindful of the complexities that shaped their lives. Simone leaned back in her chair, feeling grounded. "We're still figuring it out," she said. "We always will," Vincent replied. "That's the point." Their story didn't resolve with a dramatic twist or a clean moral. It ended with honesty. Two imperfect people making deliberate choices, understanding the costs, and carrying the lessons forward. In a city layered with history, contradictions, and enduring beauty, they found something real in the space between what should be and what is. Not perfect. Not pristine. But honest. This story doesn't offer easy answers, because life rarely does. It asks you to consider power, choice, and the thin line between protection and control. What lessons do you take from Vincent and Simone's journey? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that push us to think deeply about love, agency, and the decisions we make. Your support helps us keep bringing these powerful, complex stories to life. Come back tomorrow, there's another one waiting for you.